Hello, everyone, and welcome to Immigration and Trauma Before, During, and After. My name is Jason Jones, and I'm a social worker here at the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in today's event. Please note that upon joining the webinar, you've been placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation today. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to our host, Brianna, who will be able to assist you. You will have the opportunity to submit questions for the Q&A portion of today's presentation by utilizing the chat box feature, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. If it is not visible, click the dialog bubble on the top right toolbar and it should appear. In order to ensure that we're able to answer as many questions as time permits, we are requesting that you send in your questions at any point during the webinar, and we will address them during the Q&A portion of the presentation. And with that, we are very excited to be joined by Mr. Andres Hoyos. Andres is a social worker and adjunct lecturer at both the NYU Silver School of Social Work and the Columbia School of Social Work. He's a psychotherapist with over 25 years of experience in the provision of mental health and social services, with an expertise in a variety of areas, including the intersection of trauma and immigration. And with that, I'll hand it off to Andres to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jason, for the introduction, and Brianna for all your support in today's webinar. Welcome, everyone. I'm really happy to see the attendance for this seminar and the registration we had. This shows the interest and the awareness on the topic at hand. I want to say also that I would like to offer our time today on this work that we are doing to all these people, especially the most vulnerable immigrants, which in this case will be minors, who are putting themselves through these journeys. Every hour is estimated by the IOM, the International Organization for Migrants, that 15 children from Central America will leave their homes in hopes to make it to the U.S., and only one of them will make it. Sometimes that person might be sent back to the country of origin, and even for those who make it, sometimes the cost and the suffering is great and can leave lifelong sequels or consequences. So I wanted just to say that to kind of inspire us in doing the best and the most out of this experience today. So let's start with learning objectives. So another disclaimer before we move on. I'm recording from a cold, so I might mute myself for a couple of seconds if I feel that I have to cough. So please bear with me. So now let's get back to objectives, learning objectives. So there are just two main basic objectives that I think we will achieve today. The first one is to have a framework that will help us to have an integrated analysis of this experience of trauma for immigrants, of trauma before, during, and after the immigration process. So, and the other objective that we will have for today is to expand knowledge regarding how to best serve these communities, with emphasis in the most vulnerable. So I'm speaking about undocumented immigrants, mainly women and children, and we will talk a little bit about demographics that I'm going to be using for my references and examples. So with that, let's see the content for today. I'm going to go briefly over some basic information about global context, local context in the state, New York State and New York City, why we think immigration and trauma are important topics to be studying or understanding integrally. Then we're going to be talking about some other basic concepts like trauma. I'm not going to go too much into that there because we have other trainings here at CPAC that have been pre-recorded, so you can access a lot of those trainings based on trauma here separately. We're going to talk a little bit about the provider's cultural countertransference. Some providers might be familiar with that term. I will clarify that later. Cultural competence and cultural humility as well. We're going to talk about some considerations about trauma and immigration, the depending on the timing of these, if it happened before, during, or after immigration process, or more than one of those times. And then lastly, I'm going to have some recommendations. I will share with you some resources that I think are valuable for our work with these communities. We will have the Q&A, and you will have the references in this PowerPoint when it gets sent a couple of days after today. It should be in your hands, and announcements lastly. So let's start with global context. This information is from the UN, and it's estimated that 65.3 million people are forcibly displaced in the world. And these are estimate numbers. It's very difficult with these kind of populations to have accurate numbers because there are not systems in place to register them. So there's a lot of invisible communities that if there is not a massive number of people, perhaps small communities or a few number of people might not be counted. 42 million people are seeking refugee globally. And I want to highlight that I'm talking today not only about refugees, but you will see refugees and asylees in a lot of throughout the presentation, and that's because the undocumented immigrants, women and children, the most vulnerable coming from countries at war or escaping violence, escaping poverty, might qualify because their basic human rights have been violated, might qualify for asylum, but they might not apply, or they might not qualify because each country has the right to define their protocols of what an asylee and how to become an asylee, who is an asylee, and how to get granted that status. And it's expected by 2050 that another 25 million people will be displaced because of climate change. I will say I've been working in this field, in this matter, for over 15 years, and I remember 5 years ago when I was talking, teaching, or making presentations about the topic. Based on the research we have up to that date, the numbers were very different, way smaller than the ones that we actually have of what was projected. So what we are projecting is, specifically in the last 5 years, we have seen what happened in Europe, in Africa, and other parts of the world, in Latin America, that our projections are falling short. So 21.5 of those will be refugees, so not everybody who leaves and get granted a refugee status, and half of those refugees are minors, which is pretty problematic. So the exponential increase of number of people displaced forcefully by poverty, violence, and environmental crisis is also a concern. So we're seeing what we call the internalization or globalization of social problems. Internationalization. English is my second language, as you can tell. Okay, so we have global numbers here. Let's move into some more local numbers. So we have that in the U.S., this is a country that was built and is still perceived as a safe haven for immigrants. So it's one of the main countries in the world to host immigrant communities. 13% of our U.S. population, based on our last census, is foreign-born. And in New York State, we have about 4.4 million immigrants. Sorry, there is a typo space that I need to add later. This means 22% of the state's total population is foreign-born. It's the second largest immigrant population after California. So that's why this is so relevant here for us in New York State. Immigrants in New York represent 150 nations, and I want to highlight that because that means we're going to see later that for cultural competency, one of the challenges that we face as providers is being able to generalize theories and apply best practices to different communities. When there is so much diversity in nationality, culture, and language, this can place a big challenge. Most immigrants in New York State are coming from Latin America, That's why I'm putting this population as kind of a focus of our presentation today. In New York City, 43% of the population is foreign-born, and it's estimated that 500,000 might be undocumented, with over 800 languages, different languages being spoken in New York City. And language is a huge component of treatment, access to services, etc. We're going to see that later as well. So imagine not only 150 different nations, and each nation can have several different cultures within themselves, within itself, and then all these languages, and then trying to be culturally competent and provide services the best we can. Okay, so why immigration and trauma? Why the overlap of these two? Undocumented immigrants being those who might qualify for asylum or who are refugees or asylum seekers, oftentimes are treated as criminals, seen as unwanted immigrants, people who are taking advantage of the system or taking jobs away from locals, and can become easy targets for exploitation. And we have that in the top right corner, the map of the states. And I want you to look closely, not just the frontier that is marked there, but that's a picture of the wall and all these discussions as to building a wall and what it means for all these communities that are trying to mobilize themselves up north, coming to the U.S. So besides that, we know in research, based on research, that immigration has a higher correlation, and immigrants have a higher prevalence of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, substance abuse, and many other mental health and physical health conditions. Most of them have some or many of their human rights being violated, unmet basic needs, such as not having food or malnutrition, not having shelter, not having access to health, education, etc. So that would be one reason why immigration of these within these communities is so prevalent. And there is an exponential increase in the number of undocumented women and children coming from Latin America. We have seen that definitely in the last 5 years, and it's expected to increase. So basic concepts. I'm going to go through the definition, and I will advise you to look into our CTAC trainings if you want to learn more about this, or reach out for further knowledge, because these are important concepts to clarify. So the first one is about trauma. When we talk about trauma, we usually think about an event that is overwhelming. And trauma is not defined by the event in itself, but by the personal experience. So we should talk about potentially traumatic events, which means what is traumatic for one person might not be traumatic for another person. Or what is traumatic for one person now might not have been in the past. The person might have faced a very similar experience and still not develop any symptomatology or not develop full PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and because of the new conditions, these might play out differently. This is pretty frequently the case of immigrants when they are in the host country during the first 5 years. The fact of being displaced from the country of origin, even if the conditions were difficult there, at least there are known environments, language, culture, support networks, etc., even if those are minimal. And being in a new country, even if this is a safe haven, but the lack of knowledge of the system, their rights, language proficiency, and other factors might impede or might exacerbate or increase the likelihood, let's say, that they will develop symptoms, mental health symptoms, including, and physical symptoms, including PTSD. Vicarious trauma speaks about the concept that trauma is not only when I experience that directly as a person, but also I can be impacted and experience traumatic events indirectly. Indirectly could be because others that I know have gone through it, have suffered, or because other people like me that I identify as might have been victimized, might have been victims of, might have had experiences of trauma. We had that. We learned more about this after September 11, when we saw that many people would have developed PTSD symptoms, not by being at the event or by being in close proximity, but because they had coworkers who were there, they had worked there before, or if it had been in a different day, in a different time, they could have been there, or people just watching the news. There was so much information in the media that was enough to cause traumatic symptomatology in the community. So that is another important concept to keep in mind. Complex trauma. So trauma initially was understood as one single event that has an impact on a person's life. But we know that many of these people living in war zones, escaping from poverty, might have chronic trauma or complex trauma, and this speaks to experiences that are not that clear-cut as to when the traumatic experience started and when it ended. This would be pretty easy to relate to a child who has suffered neglect or abuse, physical abuse or sexual abuse on an ongoing basis, sometimes by different people in different circumstances. So trauma can be also a collective of different experiences that might make it more complex to understand and also to treat. And then the last component I want to bring to our awareness is maternal buffer. Or maternal buffering is a concept that in reality doesn't only apply for maternal figures or female characters, but it's basically speaking to the trauma, the experience of trauma in minors is heavily impacted by how their caretakers and support network, the closest support network, reacts to that event. So, for example, if I have a client who is a minor, a teenager, coming from Central America to the States, and in the process they suffered amputation or sexual abuse, they were mobbed, or potentially traumatic events were experienced, a lot of the outcome of that experience or how they might or may not develop symptomatology is determined by how their support networks will react. For example, what my mother will say, what my father will say, what my spiritual person will say, or mentor, or my older brother. So it's very important to assess when there is experiences of trauma in minors, in children, to understand how was this trauma understood and what was the reaction of those adults around them. Okay. So now we're going to move to the concept of cultural countertransference, and this speaks to the following concept. When we are providers, we have an understanding of our own culture, and we have preconceived notions of other cultures because we know them somehow, because we know them very little, because we don't know them at all, and of our own culture as well. So this has an impact in our cognition as a provider, what I think of the other, and our affect, what I feel about the other. So I might think that the other is someone in higher status than mine or lower status. I might feel pity, I might feel anger, I might feel, so it's feelings and thoughts related to the culture, the reaction to the culture of the other. That's what we call cultural countertransference. So when working with immigrant communities, it's very important to be aware of our own culture, class, race, or any demographic that is important to us or might be of importance to the client. Sometimes, let's say, locally, gender issues may not be a big thing for us as providers, being a male or female, but in the country of origin for the client might be a huge issue if I'm interacting, if it's male-to-male interaction, provider-client, or a female-to-male, client-provider, or vice versa. The provider is a male and the client is a female. So there are also differences and commonalities. Usually when we talk about cultural countertransference, people have very clear understanding of the importance of being in tune with the differences. When the other one is very different from my culture, my religion, my race, my identity, I need to be aware of how much I know about the other and how I feel about the other. But also when it's very similar. For example, I am an immigrant from Colombia, and I could be working with a client who identifies as Colombian, even from the same city, even around the same age, even around the same gender, but just one marker in our social location or demographics can make a huge difference. Perhaps our political affiliation, our class or status, access to education, and other things that come with that. So it would be a mistake to make an assumption that because I'm Colombian and we're about the same age and come from the same city and around we have very similar circumstances, that it will mean the same for me that it means to the client. Oftentimes I see my clients say, oh, you're Latino, you know how that is, or oh, you're Colombian, you get me. And my response is, let's be curious. And I will say to the client, I might have some ideas, but I would rather tell me. I would rather have you tell me. What is this that works for you to be in this experience, in this situation? Because the clients also will perceive our similarities, or they will know them. Even if we don't talk about these things, the client will be aware of that. And I think it's very important to state that in order to establish a good connection and engagement process with the immigrant, we should put these power differentials on the table, or even power similarities on the table, and help the client talk through it and tell us what it means to them. When we don't talk about those, usually they can lead to early disengagement from services. We know also research, Parents Foster, Rosemary Parents Foster have done a lot of research on this, and it's been seen that ethnic minority groups have the highest premature termination rate than the general population. So this sense of feeling different than the provider or the main culture can be part of the disengagement or difficulty in engagement process. The other important piece is in cultural countertransference is that we represent power, institutional power. We represent objective reality. We're the professionals. We're the ones with the experience and the knowledge. And our reality is objective for us in this context, but we cannot be objective about the reality of the other. So important to be humble and acknowledge that we have to use this power differential in service of the client. I will talk a little bit more about this later. I just mentioned this at the beginning of the introduction, how diversity in New York State and New York City challenges our ability to generalize those theories that we learn or those interventions that we are used to implement with other clients. We make assumptions about healthy, competent behaviors. So what is expected from a client if you have an appointment and show up on time, or that you will cancel, or that you reschedule, or that if, let's say, that if you're having a conflict between paying for the Metro card to get to your appointment and saving those $2 or $3 to be sent to your country of origin, one will assume that perhaps health is first, or basic needs of the person who is here in the States is first. And the client might have a different set of priorities, and their behavior might be also heavily impacted by the culture. So a client might first reach out to their spiritual guide, or might do an offering. Let's say it's a client from Guatemala who follows some spiritual traditions and would rather do an honoring or an offering to Mochimon, who is a deity or a saint in that culture, rather than going to the psychologist or the social worker or the psychiatrist or the doctor. So important to be humble and recognize that what we understand as healthy behavior might not be seen by the client as such, and not to make judgments of the client if it's different from what we expect. We have American clinical training. That means we have theories that are ethnocentric, usually centric, Eurocentric, Euro-American centric, Europe and North American, and that comes with biases, right? For example, in the States, we know that we value heavily individualism. In Latino community, familism is a value that impacts ways of interacting heavily. So perhaps it's more important to protect the family unit than the well-being of the individual. Here in the States, it would be the other way around. The individual is first, then the others, the relational. And so that speaks to these values, American life values. And with that, for example, I'll share with you as an immigrant after many years of being here in the States, or a decade, I have incorporated the value of punctuality, and I have to take that in consideration because even though that helped me to adjust and function well here in the States with mainstream society, when I'm working with immigrants, I might be reminded, especially Latino immigrants, that time is different, and if there are undocumented immigrants with basic needs unmet, perhaps circumstances will place more challenges for them to be punctual than I will expect. So let's keep ourselves in check of all these things. So as a summary, cultural countertransference will also impact the way we see events and the symptomatology. For example, for us, something could be very traumatic, but for the client may not be, because in their culture, based on their experience, they might have a different understanding of that event, or vice versa. Something that for them can be very traumatic, for us may not be, because of our own realities here in the States. And with that, we may mistreat the symptomatology associated with that. Okay. Now let's move forward to our next slide. This is the last piece on cultural countertransference. And I think I can move forward here. We talked already about the academic impact. We see people through the theories that theoretical beliefs that we were exposed to during our professional training and career experience. We also have personal-driven idealization and prejudice toward ethnic groups. So we do have feelings and thoughts to other groups, but professionally, we're told that we're supposed to be at ease with every group and open-minded, and that we don't have cultural biases, and that we are free of ethnic prejudices. So what I will emphasize here is please be humble and recognize that we all are byproduct of our societies and our times, and we represent a lot of these things that sometimes are not very busy, or we are not very comfortable acknowledging that there is some level of racism, perhaps sexism, perhaps ageism, or that we may have biases towards certain specific groups, political groups, religious, spiritual groups, etc. If we recognize them, I think it's then easier to work with them without oppressing the client, without creating iatrogenesis, so without harming the client in the name of the good. We also have personal-driven biases about our own ethnic group because it's the one that we know best. So if I don't know anything or know very little about the other group, I might place normality and make positive judgments about my own cultural group and their norms, and negative or question those of other groups. Okay, and now we're gonna pretty much explain. So let's be willing to question our ethnocentrism and be willing to explore both differences and similarities and how those can impact the relationship with the client. So this is kind of reflection of and tools to understand better how we can be better prepared to interact with this client. The last two concepts I'm going to be talking here about is cultural competence, and many people have heard these. A lot of people are very familiarized. I'm just going to remind us that this is speaking about the ability to learn and build verifying cultural and community norms, verified, so different, interacting with difference in a productive way, not in a judgmental way. Being able to provide effectively services to the community that we are interacting with, being different and well. And we need to include, in order to be culturally competent, we need to include, of course, culture that also includes religion and spirituality. I see oftentimes people oversee these, and it has a powerful place in mental health and social health. Spirituality and religion can be very complex. I see a lot of clients from Latin America sometimes reporting just the main religious group that is known in their own culture, and then when exploring further, there are usually a combination that becomes way more complex. For example, Santeria and a little bit of, the client will refer, I was raised Catholic, but perhaps there is some practices of Santeria mixed with that Catholicism. And Santeria, for example, being very different how it plays out in Cuban community versus in Brazilian community or in other places of Latin America, or Spiritism or other spiritual practices that might have been oppressed or seen as less than. So all of these need to be taken in consideration, but also language. And when we were talking about 800 languages, then how do I make sure that my agency and I, as a provider, I'm doing the best I can to be linguistically competent, meaning how much do I know about that native language of the client, and do I have services in that language, either with translator services, translation, or otherwise. And if not, at least to be aware of the impact. It's not going to be just the same. Even if the client is completely bilingual, and I will speak a little bit later about that, of the impact of in neuropsychology and cognition of working on trauma in the primary language versus the secondary. The emotions are codified in the primary language, and we can intentionally use either one, the primary or the secondary language, to approach trauma effectively and help the client. So being bilingual, for example, that's definitely an excellent tool in working with this community. The new concept, this is a newer concept. In 2013, this concept was introduced, and it's cultural humility. I have in the reference area the article that speaks to this, and the Association of the American Psychiatric Association also quoted these. And cultural humility, I think, is very important. It refers to the ability of maintaining the center in the client's culture, so in the other-oriented type of work. So it's kind of giving up on my privilege culturally and try to operate with the client as if we were in their culture to understand the reality. So, and then we as providers will have to navigate the differences or the tension or the challenges that come with discrepancies between the culture of origin and the host country's culture. So it's not about our sense of normalcy or what is adequate or what is right, but what is for the client's culture. That is definitely more important. Okay, here's the presentation. So let's talk a little bit about the before, during, and after. And I want to be mindful with time so we have enough time for questions. So here we want to explore all kind of events that the client has had before immigration. Especially we will see there are two concepts that are very helpful to understand. One is what are pushing factors and pulling factors. Pushing factors is what are those things that make the client think or the person think that they would be better off leaving their native culture, country. Sometimes it's hunger, violence, extreme poverty, lack of access to medication, education, violation of their human rights, basically. And there are geopolitical and environmental crises that can also be pushing factors. pushing them away from where they were initially. And there oftentimes is a mix. It's not only environmental, it's not only political. For example, what we saw what happened in Katrina, it was not only an environmental issue, it was an infrastructure, lack of infrastructure and other systemic things that were in place that then with that environmental crisis created these huge events. So we have the same situation in Latin America, flooding in Guatemala that led to displacement of people towards the north. Some of them came to the States. But it was not only the flooding, it's why these people were in areas that were at high risk of flooding. And we see that usually are the most impoverished and vulnerable communities, the ones that are put at higher risk or are exposed to higher risk. And therefore, they are the ones that suffer displacement or are pushed away from their place of origin. Chronic exposure to potentially traumatic events or these hard experiences in life over and over can lead also to wanting to be in a different space. And for all these reasons, just this is a note that we should do biopsychosocial assessments or any kind of intake assessments, including way more information than we usually do with a regular client about their country of origin or that culture and place of origin. And then we have pulling factors. Pulling factors are all these components that will make the person want to go to this host country. Sometimes those are realistic, and they have realistic expectations. Some of those are their fantasy, or because 50 years ago or 30 years ago, my uncle did this, and this is the outcome, I think I should be doing that as well, or it's my best option. So, for example, they might be coming for employment, or to access health, or for safety, or for any other basic need, right? So good to assess what is that they were thinking they will get when they will arrive at the host country here to the States, and how much that is there or not, how much discrepancy is between what they expected and what they found, because these might exacerbate their symptomatology if they suffer trauma or decrease their ability to cope with the challenges that they are facing. So resiliency may be impacted. Now, before immigration, it's important also to try to track pre-departure context, chief determinants of health, of relocation. This means what are the general things that make them think they should go somewhere else. So we're talking about the floodings in Guatemala that led to many people being displaced and relocate. But perhaps that was not the main determinant for that client in front of you. Perhaps that person was already struggling with other things and had been considering migrating, and the flooding was just a precipitant, or perhaps was a circumstance that made them feel safer to take action because there was a large group of people doing it. They would be with other people because they heard that when things happen at large scale, like nationally, then sometimes there are treaties between countries that will allow some immigrants to have an amnesty and have immigrant status post-arrival to the host country. We've seen that with Nicaragua, Honduras in the past. Okay. Precipitants, as I said, is anything that triggers the immediate action. So why right at this moment? Why then and there you decided to leave your place of origin? What was the plan? So be very curious. What were the resources that they had or they thought they would find? What were the stressors, the things that they thought they will face, or the challenges and how they were planning to cope with those? When to leave? Why were they leaving? With whom? How was that path going to be? Do I know where to go? How many stops? What are the modes of transportation? Or I just go to my first stop, hoping that there I will find out where is the next one to follow, et cetera, et cetera. So all these organization of the immigration process is important because also will tell us the reaction to the potentially traumatic events. If I am already aware that there is potentially traumatic events and I know how to cope with them, it's less likely that if I face the event, I will develop symptomatology. It's easier to cope with something if you are prepared for that, or if you're aware of that happening. So during the process of migrating, we see that clients may experience a lot of physical, emotional, financial, and otherwise stressors, extreme conditions, days, weeks, sometimes even years, months of years, without basic needs covered, with minimal food, not access to health care, physical or mental, overcrowded conditions, etc. Potentially traumatic events would be like forced labor, marking, amputations, sexual violence, physical violence, police and other authorities abuse. And I want to stop here for a minute. And we need to know these because this will help us help the client. If I know, for example, that the client who was living in Guatemala had already negative interactions with the police system, with any government system, police or any other healthcare system, etc., or they were mistreated, discriminated against because of their indigenous ethnicity or their gender, their sexual orientation, if that happened throughout the process as well, they went into Mexico and that happened there, then when they arrive to the States, even if those clients could access or they will have their rights protected, their history of abuse explains why they were not able to access the system, sometimes in a timely fashion. So we know that for asylum in the States, someone needs to file within the first year. So 364 days they have to file before it is considered extemporaneous asylum seeking request. And it makes a big difference in timing, how expensive it can be, etc. So if we can explain, if we're filing for an extemporaneous asylum case, meaning it took more than a year, and we know that this person was petrified of reaching out to institutions because of all the negative experiences they had in the past, then we can be advocates on their behalf and explain to the immigration judge or to the attorney or to anybody else how their behavior wasn't just neglectful and they shouldn't be penalized for that, but how their behavior is in context understood, not necessarily justified, but at least understood, and then it can be considered differently. Okay. As I said, unattended medical and physical illnesses during the process of migration, so they might get worse before they can have access to better services, physically or mentally. There is already distancing of their support networks, their communities, and their physical environments, and that is a loss. And it's an ambiguous loss because it's not completely there nor there. They are not in the country of origin, they haven't arrived to their destination. They still have their families, but they are not in contact with them. They are not spending or being able to have the daily interactions. So for this, I quote ambiguous loss. That is a theoretical concept that Pauline Pauls introduced, and it's going to be in your resource list. Disenfranchised grief, negative things that happen that the client cannot share with others out of shame. For example, being raped. A lot of these immigrants don't want to share with providers, or they don't want to return to their countries of origin, and they would rather stay somewhere else. Let's say the Guatemalan client might decide to stay in Mexico rather than coming back to Guatemala because they feel as a failure, they feel like a loser, they feel less than, they feel like damaged goods because of the experience that they encountered. After immigration, so the normal process of any immigrant is resettlement, and there is an adjustment process. It can come with challenges and mental health issues. We know that adjustment disorder should resolve itself within 6 months after the stressor that caused the adjustment has terminated. We know that for immigrant communities experiencing trauma, this is not the case. Trauma might inform their mental health conditions even past 5 years after arrival to the host country. So this is important to know as well, so we can help clients understand why they are feeling the way they are feeling. Sometimes they think that they are the problem, and we can help them understand how this is outside of their control and the conditions that led to that. And there are a lot of changes in social location, power, and privilege that are important to take, even when those are gains. We think that if something improves, then it's for good. So let's say there is a couple, heterosexual couple, migrating to the States, they get to New York, and the man is unable to find a job, and the woman gets a job as a nanny or has ability to make more money than him, and this power differential can strengthen the relationship and can also lead to negative outcomes. We know that with immigrant communities, undocumented, these kind of power shifts are associated with domestic violence. So important thing to take into consideration, the fear of repatriation, being sent back, is constant, and we need to know what that means for the client. How is this impacting their daily life? Isolation is something that usually happens in this resettlement process. But if we are talking about people who experience trauma, the symptomatology of trauma can lead to even further isolation. So rebuilding support networks for clients who have experienced trauma is going to be more challenging. Having trust in the system, reaching out, so the timing might be different, might take longer. They might be more ambivalent. They might be more resistant, as we will say. So be careful not to blame the victim, not to make them responsible for things that are normative of their experience, right? So this will speak also to the need of adjusting programs to this community. Serving this community is not going to be the same as serving, let's say, an expat immigrant or a person who is internally relocating within the country, someone from the West Coast to the East Coast and is having an adjustment, a resettlement adjustment. It's going to be very different. Okay, and there is also downturn in socioeconomic status, usually at least for the beginning period, and this is important to take in consideration. Culturally, we have this very strong value of the American dream. We want to think that everybody who wants to do it, regardless of who they are, regardless of their age, sex or gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, political affiliation, that everybody here can make it if they want, and everybody can achieve their fullest potential. Yes, that is the case, but it's the case for some, not for all. And we have to be careful not to impose these on the client or not to be blind if the client is only seeing these. Because sometimes clients will find themselves living in conditions even more difficult than the ones that they had before. They knew that they were going to be making more money here in the States, but they didn't know how much it would cost to survive, to get food, to get transportation. Or once they're here, they have responsibilities with their communities in their country of origin. They have to pay the coyote. Otherwise, their child, their significant other, their parents might suffer consequences. So even though they might have access here to a higher level of income, that might not translate.
Hi, everyone. We are experiencing a little bit of technical difficulty. Please bear with us. We're going to try to get Andres right back. Hi again, everyone. So unfortunately, Andres' phone was disconnected. We are just going to give it 2 more minutes for him to get back on, and we should be with you again shortly.
Okay, I'm back. And Brianna, Jason, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. You're back on. Sorry for the delay, everyone. So Andres, if you have time, we would love to just finish out the presentation. And everyone that submitted questions, if we're unable to get to them, we will try to send you the answers after the webinar. Thank you.
Sounds great. Yes, apologies for that glitch. Technology, sometimes things happen, and here we are. So after immigration, important to assess level of fluency in English, things that might be different between the traditions of that culture of origin and the host country. That's what these tonic ethnic traditions is referring to. We talked about how difficult it might be for clients to develop support networks, so they would be avoiding that because of the experience of trauma, and therefore how important it is for us as providers to do community organizing, to help people connect with each other, other immigrants, other trauma survivors, other people that can be support to them, and they can be support to as well. Okay, and so I'm going to move quickly just because of time. One of the important things in this slide I want to highlight is let's make sure that the clients have expert advice. A lot of times they're going, and when I said expert advice, is a reliable immigration attorney or an agency that knows about their immigration law. A lot of times I see clients being victims of predatory practices of people who are doing unethical things, people who are not attorneys, taking their money, promising them this and that, and then leaving them sometimes in worse conditions because they thought they were being taken care of. So appropriate referral sources on a legal area. There are a bunch of recommendations very connected with everything that I said. I'm going to go quickly through these so we can cover resources as well and finish the presentation. We have just 6 minutes left. So basically, assessment, it should happen in the first language because it's when the emotions are codified, and if it cannot happen in the first language, take notice that there is going to be differences in how the client is referring the experience to you, and that means also to the attorney or to the judge. So sometimes clients talking about their traumatic experience in a second language, one, because of the experience of trauma, they might be numb, so they don't connect the emotion with the experience when they are talking about it, but also because there is another layer of disengagement, which is the second language. It's not the primary language, but is highly connected with their emotional self. They might not have an affective response as we will expect. So the client might be talking about this horrific experience with no emotional response. Therefore, the judge or the attorney or someone who doesn't know about trauma might make a judgment saying, they didn't really, they're lying, that didn't happen. If that was true, I wouldn't expect the person to be able to relate the event like that. Or sometimes even missing information. So the client may block very important parts of the experience, the traumatic experience, and not be able to remember. And that might not make sense to other providers. So important for us to educate the client and educate other people, advocate on behalf of clients' well-being. The use of the second language, one, will come with some level of anxiety because the level of mastery usually is not the same, and the symptoms are going to be expressed differently. So the ideal would be to have the assessment in both languages and then compare what is different and why. And during the interventions, we can use the second language as a way of detaching the client from the painful experience intentionally. For example, with many of my clients, when they are asylum seekers, I said, we will need to write an affidavit so you can present to the authorities or your attorney is asking for this. It has to have a lot of painful information, so why don't you tell me that story in English the best you can? Because by telling it in English, it's less off-centered, it's less upsetting. And when I'm working with the same material, but in a psychotherapeutic context, because I want them to be able to go through the motions and heal and come to closure with that traumatic event, I might do it in their native language and in a very different pace. And sometimes it's a combination, right? Okay. So We talked about this. It's very important during the assessment to be aware of the social location of the client. So what is this, and experiences of oppression and places of privilege in the country of origin, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, spirituality, class, political affiliation, and how those might change or be different. So what happened, how was that in the country of origin, and how is that in the host country? Because that might inform how are they perceiving themselves and interacting with others. These would be a multi-level. That means within the close networks, their partners, their family members, or their roommate, meso level, community level, so how these relate to church, to healthcare providers, or macro level, to the government, to the society at large, etc. Very important to always take in consideration resiliency. I am aware that we're just a minute away from running out of time, so apologies for not having followed this last slide. Here are some of the recommendations. The cultural formulation interview is a fantastic tool. I have done another recording training in Spanish and English for CTAC, so you can find all this information on CTAC. And lastly, I'm going to show you some basic theoretical models that I use, the resources that I will advise you to be familiar with, working with this community, and there are the references. So if you need anything, you have my contact information. We won't have time for Q&A, but there is, excuse me, at the beginning or at the end is my contact information. I'm here switching through. Yes, might be at the end. So feel free to contact me directly. There is my email. I'll be happy to support you in anything I can. Jason?
Thank you so much, Andres. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I do want to note that all of the resources that Andres mentioned, as well as the slides and recording from today's webinar, will be up on our website at ctacny.org. Please go there for further resources. We'll also make sure to collect all the questions that you sent in. Andres, have him answer them and then send them out to you. In addition, this same webinar will be presented tomorrow by Andres in Spanish from 12 to 1 p.m., so please inform others within your networks that if they'd like to hear the webinar, they can tune in then. And lastly, we just want to thank everyone for joining us and bearing through the technical difficulties, and we hope to see you next time. Bye, everyone.